Hello, everyone, and welcome to altc 2022. I am really happy to introduce today Brendan Masterson and Matt Jones from Middlesex. They are here to talk to us about the Middlesex iPad project, a case study in digital pedagogy, transformation for inclusive maths education in the face of digital poverty. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Brendan and Matt. There will be a short question and answer session at the end of this, so please pop any questions you have in the chat and we will come back to them at the end. Over to you, Brendan and Matt. Good luck.
Thank you very much. It's good to see so many people here today. So thank you. We're going to talk about the Middlesex University iPad project. So I'm Matthew Jones. My colleague here is Brendan Masterson. He'll take the second half of the presentation today. So the iPad project is really, there are a number of kind of ways to describe this, and so what we're going to do is just going to go through a journey of how we use this to solve a number of issues. So next slide, Brendan. So just to give you some background, Middlesex University is a university in North London. It has a kind of a broad range of students. In particular, it takes a number of students that are predominantly from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds. For example, nearly 3 in 5 students come from backgrounds where the index of multiple deprivation is in the lower 2 quintiles. Or another way as well, we have the second highest proportion of students who were eligible for free school meals while they were at school. So there's a lot of students who come to Middlesex from poorer backgrounds. Next slide, next bit, please. So there are a number of policies that Middlesex has that help this kind of thing. So for example, they offer a laptop loan scheme for 24 hours. They offer free printing for students, and this has been going on for about 10 years or so. Next bit, please. And then during lockdown, which we will talk about quite a bit, that was extended to loan laptops for much longer period of time, and these were couriered to students. So next one, please. So why is that important? Well, it's important in this context in particular because students from poorer families have a number of disadvantages, not just their socioeconomic background, but the way they relate to digital education. So students, they're much findings from, for example, the 2018 Ipsos Think survey found that students were much more likely to be online from poorer families, but the time they spent online was less quality time, I guess. So less time learning, more time on TikTok. TikTok and not learning. So they come to university with a lower kind of expectation, I guess, or lower skill set. Next slide, please. Given that, okay, in 2017, something like that, Middlesex introduced a standard TEL threshold for all modules, and modules were expected to produce videos before and after learning sessions. They were, little snippets to help to give students a chance to get something to consume. So sorry, I'm reading the chat halfway through. So and that caused problems for the maths team in particular, because of course it's quite difficult. If you know anything about developing maths for web consumption, then it's quite difficult to do that. I mean, there are ways around it, but it's consuming and awkward. So we phased in the use of iPads. So the department used iPads, gave iPads to staff throughout 2018 in order to help with this. Next slide, please. And what we were using them for was creating slides, we were creating videos, we were using them in class to record lectures. So the kind of things that we were doing were pre-record or pre-preparing PDFs and recording kind of annotation on these PDFs using various apps, and providing students with a video and full audio of these things after class to work on. And this was hugely popular. Because, and I think it didn't have the effect we were worried about. So we didn't see any drop in attendance, the fact that we were recording these lectures. And in fact, what we found was that students were attending class and we're attending classes, but then also viewing the recordings of these same classes on average 3 times. So it was really being used back then. So next slide, please. We were using, because what it allowed us to do is it allowed us to then kind of make use of some of the apps that are available for iPads. So for example, using the graphical calculator apps. This is Desmos that you see here. But which was kind of standard, is kind of straightforward, the use of something like this. And it's the kind of thing that you could have done before anyway. But if you go to the next slide, then you can see that what we were finding was that actually we were able to use interesting and exciting ways of engaging students, such as augmented reality, using the iPads as well. And because, if you move on, Brendan, because the university has a subscription to Microsoft 365, we could use the facilities of OneDrive and so on to really streamline the feedback that students were getting. So we were producing shared OneDrive folders for students. They were then able to get formative feedback on their work almost instantaneously, and importantly, it made it, this kind of thing made it easier for staff as well. Okay, so it wasn't this extra layer of difficulty that staff had to cope with. It became this more efficient way of doing this, and it dealt with the kind of difficulties of mathematical notation, because you could just write on these things. And so we carried on. We kind of carried on extending what we could do. If you go to the next slide, we're in a department, or maths is in a department that includes engineers and product designers and so on. And product designers were using the iPads in a slightly different way, because what they do a lot of the time is they do kind of these workshops where they're being all creative and stuff, and they do this kind of thing that you can see here, so where you've got a bunch of post-its, and I don't know what the product designers do, but they do something like this, right? Where they're coming up with creative ideas, basically. And this was then moved. They were using the iPads in a slightly different way. So you move on, Brendan. They were using Miro whiteboards. If you've seen Miro whiteboards, these are these kind of big unbounded whiteboards, and they were using them to mimic what these creative activities were doing, but in a way that allowed you to have a persistent version of the ideas that were being created here. So again, not just kind of replacing what was being done offline with online, but embellishing in it and making it a lot better. So next one, please. And this was used on the math side to kind of do the same kind of thing, to get students to think more creatively about what they were doing. You could zoom in on, you could have entire lectures on these big whiteboards. Can you move on as well now? And then, and it led to us create what we call problem-solving spaces, which were just really large, these unbounded whiteboards where students were able to work together in groups and individually. And then COVID happened. So next slide, please. And COVID happened in, the UK went into lockdown in March 2020. We very quickly realized that everything that we'd been doing, although we could translate everything that we were doing online, it was a problem for students because they, coming back to the background of our students, they didn't necessarily have the technology to engage with it. So the department rented and bought a kind of a subscription from Apple to allow students to have their own iPads and pencils. And so these were all returning and new students in 2020 were given iPads and were allowed to engage this. Can you carry on? And again, basically the overall idea was to allow them to engage with what we were doing and really improve how they collaborate. Next one, Brendan. And again, coming back to the makeup of the students at Middlesex, this had a huge impact. Yeah, so you went from doing what we can do in class and kind of presenting it online to allowing, making sure students could do it as well. Next slide, please. So in March 2020, when we first went into lockdown, we went from realizing students didn't have even a device to engage with the work to being able to essentially stream live lectures like you can see here, and use the kind of technology that we had and kind of take notes, for example. And this is just one example of how you might use it. Other examples, if you go to the next slide, then you can see that using these Miro boards again, I mean, there are other things that we used as well, but Miro boards are particularly impressive. You have this, online tutorial where students are working live, solving problems and kind of collaborating. And on the next slide, you can see that, students working together, the green writing and the black writing are two different students giving each other feedback, telling each other well done at the end of it, basically. And so using these kinds of ideas, using this kind of new approach allowed us to really improve the teaching. If you carry on, then I won't say any more about this. I won't go, but essentially just kind of, using these boards, they allowed us to collaborate. And I'll let you carry on, Brendan.
Okay, so then in February 2021, when we were, coming back to on campus, we decided to survey the students and see how they found, how useful they found the iPads that they'd been using during the pandemic. And the survey was of all our undergraduate maths programs and our MSc Financial Maths. We got 17 responses in total. And the first thing we asked students was, well, when you first got the iPad, what did you think would help with? And what we see here from all of these responses is pretty much that it allowed them to collaborate with each other, allowed them to access their material, and allowed them to interact with their lecturer. So really, they seem to think that this would really just make things easier for them to learn during the pandemic. And then when asked how effective the iPads were at solving these challenges, well, you can see here, everyone more or less said it was very helpful, it was very effective, improved how interactive things were. There was some issues, perhaps around poor internet connections. The university did send out internet dongles for some of these students who really suffered due to poor internet connections, but the iPads themselves, the students found very, very effective. When it came to how good the iPads were at supporting their mathematics, you see here some students saying it was a game changer, it shortened their coursework, and again, it was all about student collaboration and allowing them to engage with the material. So that seems to be a repeating theme, is collaboration and the ability to engage. Okay, and yeah, how has the iPad improved the way in which you learn? Again, it's really here we see that students are saying it's made them more efficient, that it's helped them get feedback quicker, allowed them to collaborate again, and efficiency. Okay, so, and really one student up here saying that really took the stress out, okay, which was particularly important during the pandemic, to really just do anything we could to ease stress for our students. And what we decided to do is, now that we were coming out of the pandemic, although we're still coming out of the pandemic, we were going through a revalidation process of our undergraduate maths programs. And what we decided is, well, since staff, these iPads are very popular with staff and they're clearly very popular with students, why not try and design our programs to really include these and build our programs around them, so that all the work can be completed on the iPad by the students. Staff can give all their feedback on the iPad, and all the reference material, the notes, slides, what have you, would all be in an iPad accessible format. Okay, so the first step of this was to allow the students to work directly on the VLE. So by this I mean, for each of the module, each student received a personalized folder which only they and the module leader had access to. The student could simply just upload work there. The lecturer would get notification when this happened, and they can just go in and scribble some notes, scribble some feedback, and upload that again for the student. And really, it just streamlined things. Student would get notification when they received feedback. And again, the important thing to note is that this didn't create any extra work for the staff member. If anything, as Matt said, it would make it a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. Okay, and then also convert the material into a format that would suit an iPad with LaTeX. This was relatively quick and easy, which this being, if you're familiar with Matt's notes, most of our lectures use LaTeX anyway, so for most people this was relatively painless. For Word or PowerPoint, it perhaps took a little bit more work to make sure that the layout was correct. And cheat sheets, so often when we prepare notes for our students in the past, it would have been pages and pages of notes, and students would have to scroll in. Here with the iPad, we could just create a 1-page or 2-page cheat sheet where the students could just zoom in on the relevant material they need. So when it came to getting the material ready and providing feedback, it really wasn't that much work at all to really do it. But when it came to assessment, is where we were currently working on this, and we have been working on this for the past year or so. And then really we decided to take advantage of the fact that we knew that all students had the same piece of hardware and the same access to all the software. So previously, when we talk about assessment and trying to include technology, can be often difficult because you don't know what students have access to. Here, we know that all students have access to iPads and they all have the exact same software on these iPads. So that really allowed us to change things. And the first way in which we did this was to take what we thought was a more inclusive approach to assessment. Okay, so what we did here was allow the students to have optional modes of assessment. So if a student could be given a report or some sort of thing to express, they could either write a report, or we could give them the option to make video commentary. Or if they were given a mathematical problem, we'd ask them to show their work in a kind of traditional written mathematical way, or they could record an audio explanation. If they were given some reading material, they could write a critique of an article, or they could record a commentary. And it's just about building that little bit of flexibility in, so the students can really choose to which mode of assessment really best demonstrate that they had achieved a learning outcome. Okay, and again, this doesn't bias one student against the other, because again, they all have the access to the same hardware and software. And it also reduces the need for reasonable adjustments, because the flexibility for reasonable adjustments is already baked in from the beginning. Okay, and then this also further allowed us to be a bit more creative, even with our more pure mathematics courseworks. So this is an example from one of our third-year multivariate calculus courseworks. So if you have ever studied maths, you may be aware that this traditionally is quite an abstract and pure module, whereas what we decided to do is try and make it a bit more authentic, a bit more real world. So traditionally, in most multivariate calculus courseworks, you'd be given some sort of surface and you'd be given some sort of integral associated with that surface, and the student would just be asked to evaluate the integrals and various different statements to do with the integral. But what we've done here, if you look at this surface, is that this surface is actually Hendon, where our campus is based. The little blue dot denotes where the local tube station is. The red dot is where our campus is, and you can sort of see the steep walk our students have to make to campus whenever they come to on-campus lectures. And even that little change straightway makes it a bit more real world for the students. They now have an appreciation that this sort of topic does have real world application in terms of material like ordnance survey maps. Okay, and then when you come to the actual material itself, you can see that, for instance, question 5, students are told that all multivariate polynomials are differentiable at every point in the domain. But again, they're given the option to either write an explanation, draw an illustration, record or audio or visual explanation of, to demonstrate why this is true. So again, it's just about allowing them the option. Okay, so perhaps it's a little unsurprising that this position is perhaps a little bit unpopular with the learned societies associated with maths and statistics. They've basically come out with statements saying that they would prefer that we return to on-campus, in-person traditional exams, whereas what we believe is that we should be taking the lessons that were learned during the pandemic and really trying to build on those. This generation coming through university at the moment are digital natives, so we should be teaching them how to use that and really, where we can, try and base our assessment through that medium. Okay, and we did also receive some pushback from our external examiners, but we were able to make the case and explain where we were coming from and convince them that this was the way to go. So it took a bit of convincing, but we got there. And just this past year, we conducted a survey on students on how they found this approach to assessment. Okay, and the main things that we were concerned about were the students, first of all, aware of the choices that they had? And if they were, how did they make their choices, the attitudes towards these different modes of assessment, and what obstacles prevented them from choosing a mode of assessment that they may have initially considered. Okay, so when it came to what mode of assessment best shows their ability, it's perhaps a little bit unsurprising that no student liked tests, either short or long or take home. But what we saw was that most students really preferred just traditional mathematics written coursework. So the kind of coursework that have been present on maths degrees for a very, very long time. Perhaps surprisingly, multimedia submissions and portfolios works were very unpopular. And this was, when we're looking at feedback, this was because students felt that multimedia submissions in particular would be time consuming and stressful, and a lot more work they felt to get it up to the standard that they would wish in order to submit it. So perhaps that's something that we might want to try first and second year. I really encourage the students there to just get them used to it. Okay, and then when it came to actually completing the work, this is feedback we actually had. So again, it's not surprising that math students here tend to be, in general, very good at writing line by line mathematical explanations, but when they're asked to then put their explanations into words, that's where a lot of math students traditionally struggle, and it's what we're seeing here with our students, that the written English explanation is something they found very difficult. But they also had issues with time management and the anxiety of stress when it comes to actually starting coursework. But perhaps encouraging, they had no problem doing the calculations, or understanding the question. What they maybe struggled with a bit was finding appropriate theory. So I guess the idea is once they understand the maths, they completing the question they found relatively straightforward. But it's noteworthy that most of the responses from this survey were mainly third-year students, where optional assessment was new in their final year. So that goes back to what I said previously about maybe perhaps in the future we should be trying to introduce this a little bit earlier, and then some of these opinions might shift. Okay, so in summary, we have really taken the lessons from these iPads. They've proved very popular with staff and students, and we've used this in technology enhancements to really give students options on how they demonstrate how they've achieved learning outcomes. Okay, and again, this really promotes equality of access, because we know that each student has access to the same hardware, software, and everything they need for their studies. The iPads have really become a one-stop shop for them, and from the feedback has changed how the students approach their coursework because of the iPads. But yeah, we're also getting feedback from students on the assessment, so it really makes them partners in this. So preliminary results is that technical material students understand well. When it comes to actually expressing in English how to approach our maths, it's a little bit harder, but we're going to try and bake that into level 4 and level 5, and hopefully that will change over time. But yeah, and that's it. So thank you for listening to us, and any questions?
Thank you so much, Brendan and Matt. That was wonderful. I really loved all the interactive videos you put into that presentation to let us actually see how the students use the iPads. I've got 2 questions I'd love to throw at you before we have to wrap up. First one is from Peter Hartley, who asks, how are you going to develop this further?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, because the student numbers on the maths degree are quite small. Okay, then it's that at that scale it's possible to do this kind of thing, but we are looking at how you scale this up. So we have some of the big modules that we teach in support as the in the business school, and we're looking at ways in which you can scale that really. Because that's going to be the difficult thing, I think. It's making sure these things work. So there are difficulties with making sure equal types of assessment are marked in the same way. But that's not too difficult. That's more about designing the rubric well. But yeah, I mean, there are issues. We are looking at them. This is a continuous thing. That's the thing. This is just where we are at the moment, really, and we are looking to ways of improving these approaches.
Okay, and I'll share one last question from Alistair McNaught. Perhaps we can carry on the rest of the conversation on Discord. Alistair says, great examples of inclusion in these pedagogies, but I wonder if the technologies might create barriers for other disabled students, for example, poor motor skills who can't use a pen, or screen reader users. Was this a problem you experienced? If not, has there been a discussion about how it might be handled without losing the benefits of the current approach?
One of the students who does use this is actually quadriplegic, and it can only has some movement in one arm, and but they arrived at the university already having answered many of these questions, how they were going to deal with it, and they were using iPads anyway. If there are issues, and if there are going back to what Brendan was saying, we will look at how you bake all of this in at the start of these things. I mean, it's possible, of course. We have an example of how it's been done for really a pretty extreme case. But you know, a lot of the problem with a lot of these things is that you often end up trying to solve the problems when they arise. I think there are solutions out there. The screen reader, we have had experience of that as well, working with screen readers. With handwritten maths, that's difficult. Okay, but you know, the way we would normally do it was treat it, you know, as a case on a case by case kind of approach, really.
All right, I'm so sorry to have to cut you guys off now, because it's been a really, really interesting conversation. Might I suggest anyone who wants to carry on that conversation, head on over to our Discord and we can follow up on questions there. But it's just left for me to say thank you very much to Brendan and Matt for that presentation. And I hope you all enjoyed the rest of the conference.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.